The spring floods of 1876 had turned the Arkansas River into a roaring torrent that made Henry Coleman's usual crossing point impassable for nearly 2 weeks. Hank stood on the bank of his property, studying the swollen waters and calculating when he'd be able to reach the trading post on the far side where he needed to purchase seed for late spring planting. His homestead sat in a particularly isolated section of central Kansas, close enough to the river to benefit from occasional overflow irrigation, but far enough from established settlements that every supply run required careful planning and considerable effort. The figure Hank spotted on the opposite bank initially seemed impossible, a person of extraordinary height standing at the water's edge, clearly trying to determine whether crossing was feasible, despite the obvious danger. Even from a distance, Hank could see this wasn't an ordinary traveler, but rather someone whose physical stature marked them as exceptional. As he watched, the figure made several tentative attempts to enter the water before retreating, the current clearly too strong and unpredictable for safe passage. Hank's first instinct was caution, as tensions between settlers and the displaced native communities in Kansas remained high, despite official treaties and enforced relocations. But watching the stranded figure's increasingly desperate attempts to cross, he recognized a human being in genuine distress, regardless of their background or the political complications their presence might create. He'd built his homestead on the principle of treating all people fairly, and that principle didn't disappear simply because helping someone might be inconvenient or socially complicated. Moving quickly, Hank gathered rope and located the strongest crossing point he knew, a spot where underlying rocks created a relatively more stable path through the flood current, though still dangerous enough that most people wouldn't attempt it during high water. He secured one end of the rope to a tree on his side and waded into the cold, powerful current, using his considerable strength and knowledge of the river bottom to work his way across. Hank was a large man himself, standing 6'4" and built powerfully from years of farm labor, but even he struggled against the spring flood's force. When Hank finally reached the opposite bank, gasping from exertion and soaked to his skin, he got his first clear look at the person he was attempting to help. She was a young native woman, probably 18 or 19, and remarkably she stood even taller than Hank himself, at least 7 feet in height, with a powerful, athletic build that suggested both genetic blessing and physical training. Her traditional clothing marked her as from one of the prairie tribes, and her face showed a mixture of relief and careful evaluation as this white stranger emerged from the dangerous current to offer assistance. "Can't cross alone," Hank said simply, gesturing to the rope he'd strung across the river and then to himself and the woman. "Too strong. Together, maybe." His words were basic, unsure if she spoke English, but his intentions were clear from his body language and the practical assessment of their situation. The woman studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to measure not just his physical capability, but something deeper about his character and motivations. When she finally nodded and spoke, her English was accented but clear. "I am Dakota. My father's people call me Sky Daughter because I grew taller than the lodges before I stopped being a child." There was neither pride nor apology in her tone, simply a statement of fact about the physical characteristic that had clearly shaped much of her identity and role within her community. "You risk much to help someone you don't know, especially one of my people when yours have taken our lands." Hank's response was characteristically direct, shaped by the practical ethics he'd learned from his own farming family. "You needed help. The river doesn't care about politics or land treaties. If I can help someone who needs it, I should. That's just what decent people do." He gestured again toward the rope and the crossing they needed to attempt. "But we need to go now while I still have strength left from the first crossing. The water's only getting higher." The crossing back was the most physically demanding thing Hank had ever attempted, supporting Dakota's considerable weight while fighting the current that seemed determined to sweep them downstream, required every bit of his strength and all his knowledge of the river's patterns and dangers. Dakota helped as much as she could, following his shouted instructions about when to push against the current and when to let it carry them into positions where footing was more secure. By the time they reached Hank's bank, both were exhausted, bruised from impacts with submerged rocks, and thoroughly soaked. As they collapsed on the muddy riverbank, catching their breath and letting the Kansas spring sun begin to warm their cold bodies. Hank noticed something that would later prove significant. On the bluff above his property, partially concealed among the prairie grasses and scattered trees, were figures watching, native men who had been observing the entire rescue. They made no move to approach or threaten, but their presence was deliberate, and their attention focused entirely on Hank and Takoda. Takoda followed his gaze and saw the watchers as well. Her expression showed no surprise, only a kind of resigned acknowledgement. "They have been watching this river crossing for many days," she said quietly. "Watching to see if any of the white settlers who now claim these lands as their own would help one of the people your kind has displaced. My father sent me to cross at a time when the river was dangerous, knowing that how settlers responded would tell him much about whether our peoples can find ways to live near each other without constant conflict. The revelation that his river rescue hadn't been a chance encounter but rather some kind of deliberate test created a complexity Hank hadn't anticipated when he'd first spotted someone in distress. He'd acted from simple humanitarian impulse, but that action had apparently placed him in the middle of a much larger situation involving questions about coexistence, trust, and the possibility of relationships between communities that recent history had made adversaries. "You're telling me you were put in danger on purpose?" Hank asked, his tone showing concern mixed with confusion about what kind of test would require such risk. "What if no one had helped? What if I hadn't been here, or hadn't known how to cross safely?" Takoda's smile was slight but genuine. "I would have found my own way eventually. I am not helpless despite appearances. But my father needed to know whether white settlers in these territories have any capacity for seeing our people as human beings, deserving of assistance, rather than as obstacles to be removed or problems to be managed. Your choice to risk yourself to help someone from a people your government has displaced answered his question. Now he will come to explain what that answer means and what ancient promise your action has fulfilled." As if summoned by her words, the watchers began moving down from the bluff toward Hank's riverbank property. Leading them was an older native man, whose bearing and the deference shown him by his companions clearly marked him as someone of significant authority. Chief Matto had come to meet the white farmer, who had carried his daughter across the dangerous spring flood, and in doing so, had triggered the revelation of an oath that had been hidden for generations, waiting for this exact moment when the old ways and new realities would meet in the person of someone whose actions demonstrated the capacity for the kind of relationship that both peoples would need to survive the changes transforming the Great Plains. Chief Matto approached with the careful dignity of a leader who had spent decades navigating impossible circumstances while trying to preserve his people's way of life. He was perhaps 60 years old, with grey threading through long black hair and the weathered face of someone who had witnessed both the traditional life on the Kansas prairies and its destruction through displacement and broken promises. His clothing combined traditional elements with practical adaptations to reservation life, and he moved with the deliberate bearing of someone carrying both authority and burden. The conversation that followed, conducted in a mixture of English, occasional translation through Takoda, and expressive gestures, revealed a story that transformed Hank's understanding of the land he'd homesteaded and the deeper history connecting native peoples to these prairies long before any treaties had opened them to settlement. Chief Matto explained that his people had oral traditions, predicting the coming of white settlers and the displacement of native communities from their ancestral territories. These prophecies hadn't been mystical visions but rather pragmatic assessments based on decades of watching European expansion across the continent. My grandfather's grandfather knew that someday people from across the Great Water would claim these prairies as their own, would plow the grass that feeds the buffalo and build houses where lodges once stood, Chief Matto said. His English, careful and formal, learned through years of negotiating with government officials and traders. He could have filled his people with bitterness and encouraged endless war against the inevitable. Instead, he made his people swear a hidden oath, a promise that when white settlers finally came to our lands, we would watch them carefully to find one who showed the kind of heart that might allow both peoples to share knowledge about living on these prairies. The hidden oath, as Chief Matto explained it, wasn't simply about finding a kind white person. but rather about identifying someone whose character demonstrated capacity for relationships based on mutual respect rather than dominance and exploitation. The oath required each generation to watch for signs that the time for revelation had come and to test potential candidates through situations that would reveal whether their proclaimed values extended beyond convenient circumstances into moments requiring genuine sacrifice or courage. To Coda's crossing of the flooded river hadn't been simply a test of whether Hank would help, but a carefully designed evaluation that required him to risk his own safety significantly to assist someone whose people had every reason to resent settlers like him. Many white farmers would have watched from their bank, judged the crossing too dangerous to attempt, and rationalized their inaction by noting that the stranded person wasn't their responsibility. Others might have offered help, but only if it didn't require substantial personal risk or effort. Hank's immediate response and his physically demanding rescue had demonstrated something different, a willingness to treat human need as sufficient, reason for action regardless of cultural differences or political complications. But here's what makes your action more significant than simple kindness, Chief Matto continued, gesturing toward the prairie that stretched endlessly around them. My daughter Takoda is not ordinary in her size, as you have noticed. Among our people, she represents what we call sky children, those born with unusual height who carry special responsibilities for preserving and transmitting knowledge about living in harmony with the land. When you carried her across the river, you carried someone who holds within her understanding, passed down through generations about the patterns of this prairie, the ways water moves both above and below the ground, the seasonal cycles that determine when to plant and harvest different foods, and the relationships between all living things that sustain life in this challenging environment. Hank was beginning to understand that what he'd thought was simply helping someone cross a river had been interpreted by Chief Matto and his community as something more symbolically significant, a white settler, literally carrying precious indigenous knowledge across the boundary between old ways and new realities, choosing to burden himself with that weight rather than leaving it stranded on the far side of cultural divisions. The metaphor was powerful even if Hank hadn't consciously intended any such meaning when he'd waded into the flood current to help someone in distress. Chief Matto's explanation of why Takoda's unusual height connected to her role as a keeper of traditional knowledge revealed sophisticated cultural practices that Hank had never encountered in his limited interactions with native peoples. The Sky Children, according to the chief, were identified in childhood through their extraordinary growth, and then given intensive training in oral traditions, ecological observation, and the accumulated wisdom that allowed prairie communities to thrive for generations without exhausting the resources that sustained them. Takoda's height wasn't just a genetic variation, but rather marked her as someone who had been prepared from youth to carry forward, understanding that written documents couldn't adequately capture the hidden oath my ancestor made, stated that when we found a white settler who would risk himself to help a Sky Child, we should teach that person what the Sky Children know, Chief Matto said, his tone becoming more formal as he articulated what was clearly a momentous decision. Not because we wish to give away our people's knowledge to those who have displaced us, but because the land itself will suffer if only one group understands how to live with it sustainably. Your government has opened these prairies to farming, but most settlers try to force the land to produce like the eastern territories they came from. This approach will fail, will exhaust the soil and waste the water, will turn productive prairie into dust. If some white farmers learn what the Sky Children know, perhaps the damage can be limited. The weight of what Chief Matto was proposing settled over Hank like a physical burden. The chief wasn't just offering agricultural advice or friendly tips for improving yields, but rather proposing to share comprehensive understanding about Kansas prairie ecology that had been developed and refined over centuries of careful observation and passed down through generations of specialized knowledge keepers. This was sacred information, guarded jealously by people who had every reason to resent its being given to settlers who had displaced them from the very lands that knowledge described. "Why me?" Hank asked, the question carrying both humility and genuine confusion about why his simple act of helping someone cross a river should result in such an extraordinary offer. "I'm just a farmer trying to make a living on land I legally purchased from the government. I helped your daughter because it was the right thing to do. But I don't understand why that means I should receive knowledge your people have protected for generations." Chief Matto's response revealed the complexity of leadership decisions made while watching your people's traditional way of life being systematically destroyed. Because the land doesn't care about our grief or anger, only about whether those who now claim it know how to live with it, rather than simply taking from it until there's nothing left. Because my people cannot prevent white settlement, no matter how much we might wish to. So we must find ways to ensure that this prairie we have loved and protected for countless generations might survive even under new ownership. And because the hidden oath requires that when we find one worthy of the knowledge, we must share it even if doing so feels like surrendering the last thing we have that makes us who we are. The anguish in the chief's words was palpable, making clear that fulfilling the ancient promise wasn't simply following tradition, but rather making a painful choice to share what remained precious to a people who had already lost so much. Hank felt the burden of that gift before even knowing its full contents, understanding that accepting knowledge offered under such circumstances created obligations that extended far beyond improving his own farm's productivity. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting golden light across the Kansas prairie, Chief Matto made clear what would happen next. Takoda would stay at Hank's homestead for as long as was necessary to teach him what the Sky Children knew about living sustainably on these prairies. The knowledge transfer wouldn't be quick or simple. It would require months or perhaps years of patient instruction, observation, and practical application. Hank would need to learn to see the prairie not as empty grassland, waiting to be converted to cropland, but as a complex ecosystem whose patterns and cycles determined what could be sustainably harvested and what needed to be preserved to maintain the whole system's health. "The hidden oath has been revealed," Chief Matto said, as he prepared to depart with his companions, leaving Takoda to begin her teaching. "What happens now will determine whether that oath was wisdom or foolishness, whether sharing what the Sky Children know can help preserve this land we all must share, or whether it will simply be one more thing taken from my people without truly being valued or honored. The burden is now yours, Henry Coleman, along with the knowledge that will come with it." The education Takoda provided over the following months transformed not just Hank's farming practices but his entire understanding of the Kansas prairie and his relationship to the land he'd claimed through homesteading. The knowledge the Sky Children preserved wasn't simple agricultural techniques that could be explained in a few lessons, but rather a comprehensive way of seeing and thinking about the prairie ecosystem that required Hank to unlearn assumptions he'd carried from his eastern farming background and learn to observe patterns he'd previously been blind to. The first and most fundamental lesson Takoda taught was about water, not just the obvious surface, water in rivers and streams, but the underground systems that determined where different plants would thrive and how seasonal patterns of rainfall moved through the landscape. She showed Hank how to read subtle variations in prairie grass color and health to identify underground water channels, how to recognize which plant species indicated different soil moisture levels, and how to understand the prairie as a vast sponge that absorbed and slowly released water through complex patterns that settler farming techniques often disrupted with harmful consequences. "Your people see this prairie as dry land that needs water, brought to it through wells and irrigation," Takoda explained as they walked through Hank's property and the surrounding unfenced territory. "But the prairie is not dry. It is designed to capture and hold moisture from rare but intense rainfall, storing it in deep soil and releasing it slowly through growing seasons. When settlers plow deep and destroy the root systems that create this storage capacity, they turn living prairie into dust that blows away in wind. The Sky Children teach that working with the prairie's natural water patterns rather than fighting them is the path to long-term success. The practical implications of this teaching became clear as Takoda helped Hank redesign his farming approach. Instead of plowing large areas and planting crops that required consistent moisture, she taught him to identify the specific microenvironments on his property where different crops would naturally thrive with minimal intervention. There were areas where underground water sat closer to the surface, making them suitable for vegetables that needed reliable moisture. Other sections had deeper, drier soils perfect for native grasses that could be harvested for hay or grazed by cattle adapted to prairie conditions. The key was matching crops to existing conditions rather than trying to force uniform conditions across varied terrain. Takoda's teaching about seasonal patterns revealed knowledge that took generations to accumulate and could mean the difference between successful harvests and complete crop failure. She taught Hank to observe specific bird migrations, insect emergencies, and plant bloomings that indicated when frost danger had truly passed and when planting could safely begin. She showed him how to predict drought years by watching prairie dog behavior and vegetation patterns in early spring, and how to read cloud formations and wind patterns to anticipate weather changes with remarkable accuracy. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of what Takoda taught was about the relationship between different elements of the prairie ecosystem and how disrupting those relationships could have cascading consequences that weren't immediately obvious. She explained how native prairie grasses supported insect populations that in turn fed bird species that controlled pest populations affecting crops. How prairie fires, feared by most settlers, were actually essential for maintaining soil health and preventing woody plants from taking over grasslands. How the buffalo that had recently been hunted to near extinction weren't just meat sources but rather key ecological engineers whose grazing patterns and migrations maintained the prairie's health and diversity. The Sky Children learned to see all these connections because their role is to understand the whole prairie, not just individual pieces that might be useful to humans, Takoda explained during one of their many teaching walks. When my people lived here according to our traditional ways, we took what we needed, but always within patterns that maintained the relationships between all living things. Your people's approach is to take everything possible from each piece of land until it stops producing, then move to new land and repeat the pattern. This worked in the eastern forests where rainfall is reliable and soil recovers quickly. But it will fail on these prairies where conditions are harsher and recovery takes generations. The warning in her words wasn't meant as criticism, but rather as prediction based on observing what happened. When natural patterns were disrupted without understanding the long-term consequences, Hank could already see evidence of what she was describing in abandoned homesteads scattered across Kansas. Places where settlers had tried to farm using Eastern techniques, exhausted the soil in a few years, and left behind dead land that would take decades to recover if it recovered at all. As Takoda's teaching continued, Hank found himself becoming something unexpected. Not just a farmer improving his techniques, but an advocate for approaches to prairie agriculture that most of his fellow settlers viewed as strange or impractical. When neighbors visited and saw Hank leaving portions of his property in native prairie, planting diverse crops in small patches matched to specific microenvironments rather than large uniform fields, and talking about long-term soil health rather than maximizing immediate yields, many thought he'd been influenced by native superstition rather than recognizing he was learning sophisticated ecological management that his own farming tradition lacked. The social complications of Takoda's extended stay at his homestead weren't insignificant. Some neighbors viewed her presence as inappropriate or potentially dangerous, while others were curious about the tall native woman living openly at Hank's farm and teaching him agricultural practices they'd never encountered. Hank found himself defending both Takoda's character and the validity of her knowledge, trying to explain that what looked like primitive subsistence farming was actually sophisticated, sustainable agriculture that could keep Kansas prairies productive for generations rather than exhausting them in decades. The tension between honoring what Takoda was teaching and maintaining his relationships with the settler community created a constant balancing act. Hank couldn't simply announce that he was learning sacred knowledge from a sky child sent to fulfill an ancient oath. Such an explanation would make him sound delusional and would likely bring unwelcome attention to Takoda and her father's community. Yet he also couldn't pretend that his changed farming practices were simply his own innovations, as that would dishonor the knowledge Takoda was sharing and the trust Chief Mato had extended. by revealing the hidden oath. The resolution came when Hank began framing what he'd learned, in terms that settler farmers could accept. Practical observations about Kansas prairie ecology that happened to align with traditional native knowledge, but which could be verified through farmers' own experience and experimentation. He organized informal gatherings where interested neighbors could see what he was doing differently and learn about principles like matching crops to microenvironments, preserving soil health for long-term productivity, and working with, rather than against, the prairie's natural patterns. Dakota participated in these sessions when she chose to, but Hank was careful to present her as an expert consultant rather than emphasizing the sacred nature of the knowledge she was sharing. By the time Dakota's formal instruction was approaching its conclusion, after nearly a year at Hank's homestead, the impact of the Hidden Oath's revelation extended beyond a single farm to influence how a growing number of Kansas settlers approached prairie agriculture. The knowledge the Sky Children had preserved wasn't being simply given to one farmer, but rather was beginning to spread through demonstration and practical teaching to anyone willing to observe and learn. This diffusion was exactly what Chief Matto had hoped for when fulfilling the ancient promise, not keeping the knowledge locked away with one individual, but rather letting it flow through the settler community in ways that might help preserve the prairie ecosystem, even as it was being transformed by homesteading and commercial agriculture. The day Chief Matto returned to Hank's homestead to formally conclude Dakota's teaching and acknowledge the fulfillment of the Hidden Oath brought both celebration and sorrow to everyone involved. The year of knowledge transfer had transformed Hank's farm into a demonstration of sustainable prairie agriculture that was producing reliable yields while maintaining soil health and working with, rather than against, the ecosystem's natural patterns. But it had also revealed the immense gap between what one person could learn and what generations of Sky Children had preserved, and the painful reality that so much traditional knowledge was being lost as native communities were displaced and traditional transmission pathways were disrupted. Chief Matto surveyed Hank's property with obvious satisfaction, recognizing that the ancient promise had been honored and that the knowledge Dakota had shared was being used respectfully and effectively. But his words during the ceremony that marked the teaching's conclusion carried weight beyond simple acknowledgement of agricultural success. He spoke about the burden that knowledge of sustainable land use created for those who understood it, while surrounded by others who didn't, and the responsibility that Hank now carried to advocate for practices that might seem impractical or unconventional to fellow settlers pursuing maximum short-term yields. The Hidden Oath has been fulfilled, and what the Sky Children knew about these prairies is now shared with one who will honor and use that knowledge, Chief Matto said, his formal tone marking this as an occasion of significance. But knowledge creates obligation, Henry Coleman. You now understand how these prairies can be farmed sustainably for generations, which means you bear responsibility for teaching others and for speaking against practices that will turn living grassland into dead dust. You cannot simply use what Dakota taught you for your own benefit while watching your neighbors destroy the land through ignorance. The oath requires that those who receive the knowledge must work to preserve the prairie itself, not just their own portion of it. The responsibility Chief Matto articulated was more challenging than Hank had initially recognized when first learning about the ancient promise. It wasn't enough to farm his own land sustainably. He was being asked to become an advocate for approaches that many settlers would resist because they required patience, adaptation to local conditions, and acceptance of limitations on exploitation that frontier culture generally rejected. Some neighbors already viewed Hank's farming methods as strange, and more active advocacy for sustainable practices would likely create social friction and economic pressure from those who profited from selling settlers equipment and supplies suited for eastern farming rather than prairie realities. But Dakota's perspective on what Hank's acceptance of the knowledge meant to her people and to the prairie itself helped him understand why the chief's requirements weren't optional additions, but rather intrinsic to the gift he'd received. She explained that the Sky Children didn't simply memorize farming techniques or environmental observations. They were trained from childhood to see themselves as servants and protectors of the prairie, people whose role was ensuring the land remained healthy and productive for all the human and non-human communities that depended on it. By receiving knowledge the Sky Children preserved, Hank had accepted a role that connected him to that tradition of stewardship, regardless of his settler background. When I taught you about the prairie's water patterns, seasonal cycles, and ecological relationships, I wasn't just giving you information to make your farm more successful, Dakota said during their final conversation before she returned to her father's community. I was initiating you into a responsibility that my people have carried since before anyone can remember. The obligation to protect and preserve this land so it can continue supporting life. The Sky Children don't own this knowledge for our own benefit. We hold it in trust for the prairie itself. Now you hold it too, which means you share that trust and that burden. The months following Dakota's departure tested Hank's commitment to the stewardship principles that came with the knowledge he'd received. Some neighbors who had initially been interested in his sustainable farming approaches backed away when they realized he was advocating for limitations on how much land should be plowed, restrictions on what crops were appropriate for prairie conditions, and patience with yields that were reliable but not always maximally productive. The Kansas frontier culture favored rapid exploitation and maximum extraction, and anyone suggesting restraint or long-term thinking was often viewed as impractical or as standing in the way of progress and prosperity. The vindication of Hank's approach came during a severe drought that struck Kansas in the second year after Dakota's teaching. Farms that had been plowed extensively and planted with crops unsuited to prairie conditions failed catastrophically, with the exposed soil blowing away in wind and creating dust storms that darkened the sky. But Hank's farm, with its preserved native prairie sections, diversified crops matched to specific microenvironments, and practices designed to maintain soil health and moisture retention, continued producing adequate yields even during the drought. The contrast was visible enough that even skeptical neighbors had to acknowledge that his methods offered resilience that conventional approaches lacked. The drought's impact created an opening for Hank to share what Dakota had taught him more broadly, as desperate farmers were suddenly willing to consider approaches they'd previously dismissed as impractical. Hank organized teaching sessions similar to what he'd observed Dakota conducting, explaining prairie ecology in terms that settler farmers could understand and relate to their own experiences. He emphasized that what he was sharing came from generations of native observation, and that honoring the source of that knowledge was part of using it properly. Some farmers who had previously been hostile to native peoples found their attitudes shifting when they recognized the sophistication and practical value of traditional ecological knowledge. Chief Matto's occasional visits to check on how the Hidden Oath's revelation was influencing settler agriculture revealed a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that the knowledge was being shared and used sustainably, helping preserve the prairie ecosystem even as it was being transformed by homesteading. Sadness that this preservation required giving sacred knowledge to the very people whose government had displaced and confined his community, and that so much traditional understanding was being lost because forced relocation to reservations made it impossible for Sky Children to learn through direct observation of and interaction with the territories their ancestors had known intimately. The most profound moment of reckoning came when Dakota returned to Hank's farm 3 years after her initial teaching, bringing a request that revealed the full complexity of what the Hidden Oath had initiated. Chief Matto wanted Hank to serve as a teacher for young people from his community who were growing up on the reservation, without the opportunity to learn traditional ecological knowledge through direct experience with prairie life. The forced relocation meant Sky Children were being trained from oral tradition and memory, rather than through observation and practice, and the chief worried that within another generation, the knowledge would become abstract rather than practical, stories rather than lived understanding. You now know what the Sky Children knew about these prairies through direct application and years of observation under my teaching, Dakota explained. My father asks if you would be willing to help train the next generation of Sky Children by allowing them to learn on your farm, where the land is being managed according to our traditional principles. It would mean young people from the reservation coming to stay with you for extended periods, learning from both your experience applying our knowledge and from their own observation of a prairie being maintained, according to the old ways, even though owned by a white settler. The request carried risks that Hank couldn't ignore. Teaching reservation youth might bring unwelcome attention from government officials who discouraged cultural preservation efforts among native communities, could create tension with neighbors who viewed such education as encouraging primitive ways rather than helping native peoples assimilate to American culture, and would require Hank to take on responsibilities extending far beyond simply farming his land sustainably. But refusing would mean the hidden oath's fulfillment had been incomplete, that he'd accepted knowledge without accepting the full burden of stewardship that came with it. Hank's acceptance of Chief Matto's request transformed his homestead into something unprecedented in Kansas, a place where settler, agriculture, and traditional native ecological knowledge were being deliberately integrated, where young sky children could learn through direct observation and practice, and where both communities' approaches to living on the prairie were being preserved and transmitted to new generations. The farm became a bridge between ways of knowing that official policy tried to keep separate, demonstrating that cultural knowledge and environmental wisdom could flow across boundaries when people chose to prioritize land health and community sustainability over political division. As Hank stood on his property, 5 years after carrying a giant native girl across a flooded river, watching young sky children learn to read prairie patterns while settler neighbors observed and absorbed sustainable farming techniques, he understood that the hidden oath had been about far more than agricultural knowledge transfer. It had been about creating a living demonstration that people from different communities could share understanding about the land they all depended on, that traditional wisdom and modern practices could complement rather than contradict each other, and that stewardship responsibilities transcended the political boundaries and cultural divisions that official policies tried to enforce. The success of Hank's farm had influenced Kansas prairie agriculture beyond what anyone had anticipated when Chief Matto first revealed the ancient promise. Multiple settler farmers had adopted sustainable practices based on what Hank shared from Dakota's teaching, creating a network of properties managed according to principles that honored both native ecological wisdom and practical settler needs. These farms weathered droughts better, maintained soil health longer, and produced reliable rather than spectacular yields, exactly the kind of sustainable approach that could keep the Kansas prairies productive for generations rather than exhausting them in decades of exploitative farming. But the impact extended beyond agriculture to influence how settler communities thought about their relationship to the displaced native peoples, whose traditional territories they now occupied. Farmers who learned sustainable prairie management from Hank couldn't help but recognize the sophistication of the knowledge systems his teaching represented, challenging their assumptions that native peoples were primitive or that indigenous ways of life had nothing to offer modern settlement. This shift in perception didn't erase the injustices of displacement or make reservation policies any less harmful, but it created space for relationships based on mutual respect and recognition of shared interests in maintaining the land's health. Chief Matto's final visit to Hank's homestead came during the harvest season of the fifth year after the hidden oath's revelation, bringing formal acknowledgement that the ancient promise had been not just fulfilled, but exceeded in its impact and significance. The chief arrived with a delegation of elders and sky children, including Dakota, who had become one of the most respected knowledge keepers in her generation. The ceremony they conducted combined traditional elements with acknowledgement of new realities, honoring both the ancestral wisdom that had been preserved and the unexpected pathways through which that wisdom was now being transmitted and adapted. When my grandfather's grandfather made the hidden oath, he knew that our people would one day lose control of these territories we had protected and understood for countless generations, Chief Matto said through formal translation, his words carrying the weight of history and hope. He could not prevent that loss, but he could create a pathway for our knowledge to survive even after displacement by ensuring it would be shared with those who showed capacity to honor and use it properly. You have done more than honor what Dakota taught you. You have become a teacher yourself, spreading understanding about how to live with rather than simply upon this prairie. The Sky Children now have a place where they can learn through direct observation and practice, maintaining traditions that forced relocation threatened to destroy. The chief's acknowledgement included recognition that the relationship between his community and Hank's farm had created benefits neither side had fully anticipated. Young Sky Children who trained at the homestead returned to the reservation with not just traditional knowledge, but also practical experience with settler farming techniques and equipment, better preparing them to help their families succeed in reservation agriculture while maintaining cultural practices. Settler farmers who learned from Hank gained not just sustainable techniques, but appreciation for the accumulated wisdom that generations of careful observation had produced. The exchange was far from equal. Native peoples had lost their traditional territories and been forced into restrictive reservation boundaries. But it represented an attempt to preserve knowledge and create productive relationships within the constraints of circumstances no one could change. Dakota's contribution to the ceremony revealed how much her year of teaching had meant, not just for transferring knowledge, but for her own understanding of her role as a Sky Child and knowledge keeper. She spoke about how teaching Hank had forced her to articulate principles she'd learned through observation and practice, making explicit the patterns and relationships that Sky Children often understood intuitively without necessarily putting them into words. The process of translation, both linguistic and cultural, had deepened her own understanding of what she knew and why it mattered, while also revealing which aspects of traditional knowledge could be successfully communicated across cultural boundaries and which remained embedded in native ways of thinking that couldn't easily be separated from their cultural context. When I first came to teach you, I thought I was simply giving you information about prairie ecology and sustainable farming, Dakota said, her English now completely fluent after years of serving as a bridge between communities. But what I learned was that knowledge isn't just information, but relationship with the land, with other living things, and with the responsibilities that understanding creates. You learn not just what the Sky Children know, but something of how we know it, and why that knowledge matters beyond its practical applications. That learning changed you, and watching that change helped me understand my own role and obligations more deeply. The ceremony concluded with Chief Mato presenting Hank with a staff carved with symbols, representing both his fulfillment of the hidden oath and his ongoing responsibilities as a steward of knowledge that had been entrusted to him. The staff wasn't just a ceremonial object, but a practical tool for teaching, marked with representations of seasonal patterns, ecological relationships, and principles of sustainable land use that could be referenced when explaining traditional knowledge to new students. Receiving it marked Hank's formal recognition as someone authorized to teach what the Sky Children knew, carrying forward wisdom that had been preserved for generations and adapting it for circumstances the Oathmakers couldn't have fully predicted. The Uesh, years following the formal ceremony, saw Hank's homestead become a permanent teaching center where traditional native ecological knowledge and sustainable settler agriculture were being integrated and transmitted to new generations. Young Sky Children continued their training there, learning from direct observation and Hank's guidance how to apply ancestral wisdom to the changed landscape of post-settlement Kansas. Settler farmers sent their children to learn sustainable practices that would allow their families to thrive for generations, rather than exhausting the land in a few decades of exploitative farming. The mixing of communities and knowledge systems created something unprecedented, a place where the prairie's future was being consciously shaped by people who had learned to see beyond immediate extraction to long-term stewardship. Isikui Seao, hidden oath that Chief Mato's ancestors had made generations before, had predicted displacement and loss. But it had also predicted the possibility of relationships that could preserve essential knowledge and create pathways for coexistence between peoples whose official status was defined by conflict and dispossession. The oath's wisdom lay not in preventing change that was impossible, but in preparing for change by ensuring that crucial understanding would survive and adapt through being shared with those who demonstrated capacity to honor it. Hank's simple act of Carrying a stranded native woman across a flooded river had triggered the revelation of that ancient promise and placed him at the center of a knowledge transfer that was influencing how multiple communities approached living on the Kansas prairies. He had been transformed from a farmer trying to make a living into a steward, carrying responsibility for preserving and transmitting wisdom that belonged to all people who depended on the land's health and productivity. The burden was significant, requiring ongoing advocacy for sustainable practices, continuous teaching and translation between cultural frameworks, and constant negotiation of the social and political complications that came with bridging communities that official policies tried to keep separate. But standing on his property during harvest season, watching Sky Children teach settler youth about prairie ecology, while traditional knowledge and modern techniques merged into approaches suited for the new realities of Kansas settlement, Hank understood that the burden was also a privilege. He had been given the opportunity to participate in preserving something essential that otherwise would have been lost, to serve as a bridge between ways of knowing that both had value, and to demonstrate through practical success that sustainability and respect for traditional wisdom weren't obstacles to productive agriculture, but rather foundations for long-term success. The giant native girl he had carried across the river 5 years earlier had carried within her understanding, accumulated over generations, about how to live sustainably on the Kansas prairies. By accepting the physical burden of helping her cross dangerous floodwaters, Hank had accepted the broader burden of carrying that understanding forward into a changed world where its preservation required sharing it across cultural boundaries that history and policy had created. The hidden oath had been revealed, fulfilled, and exceeded, creating legacies that would extend far beyond any individual's lifetime to influence how future generations approached stewarding the land that sustained them all. As the sun set over the endless Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, while tall grasses swayed in the evening breeze, Hank reflected on how profoundly his life had been changed by responding to a simple human need, without calculating political implications or cultural complications. The act had been instinctive. Someone needed help, and he had the capability to provide it. Everything that followed, the revelation of the ancient promise, the year of intensive teaching, the transformation of his farm into a demonstration of sustainable practices, the establishment of a permanent teaching center, had flowed from that single moment of choosing compassion over caution, action over analysis, human connection over cultural division. The hidden oath that had shaped his destiny was ultimately about recognizing that land doesn't belong to any one people, but must be stewarded by whoever occupies it, and that knowledge about sustainable stewardship must be preserved and shared regardless of the political circumstances that determine who has official control over territories. Chief Matto's ancestors had understood that displacement was coming, and had prepared for it not through futile resistance, but through creating mechanisms for essential knowledge to survive by finding its way to people who would honor and use it properly. Hank had been identified as such a person through a test he didn't know he was taking, and his response had set in motion changes that neither he nor Chief Matto could have fully predicted, but which both recognized as representing hope for the prairie's long-term survival under the new realities of settlement and agricultural development. The staff Chief Matto had given him stood by his doorway, a daily reminder of the responsibilities knowledge created and the ongoing obligation to serve not just his own interests, but the broader health of the prairie ecosystem and the communities, both native and settler, that depended on its productivity. The burden was real and ongoing, requiring constant attention and advocacy. But it was a burden worth carrying because it represented the possibility that human communities could learn from each other, that traditional wisdom could inform modern practices, and that the land itself might be preserved and protected even through the massive transitions that frontier settlement had brought to the Great Plains. The hidden oath had been revealed, and in its revelation had created pathways for understanding and cooperation that gave hope for a future where diverse communities could share responsibility for stewarding the prairie that sustained them all.